Vice Project Doom for the Nintendo Entertainment System, see, told you we'd get to it, is, well, it's not the most original game. Coming out in 1991, it borrows heavily from other more popular games from the era, and doesn't really do a lot to mask that fact. Just because it does that, though, doesn't mean it doesn't do anything interesting or original with the material it's working with. Is it fated to be just a clone of what came before, or does it manage to carve out its own identity? This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. We're going to start out with how I discovered this game, both because it was sheer luck, and because it actually ties into the very first video ever made for this channel. Back in the Dick Tracy video, I had mentioned that my local video store was selling NES games 3 for $10 in the mid to late 90s. What I hadn't mentioned was that if you didn't get the 3 for $10, the games were $5 each. Because of that, I wound up getting a bunch of weird games that I otherwise probably never would have played, just so I could get the 3 for $10 deal. And I think I'm better off for it. Vice Project Doom was such a game. Considering how much I love this game now, and yeah, I'm not going to mask the fact that I love this game, it might seem a little strange that I would have had no interest in it when it came out, until you look at the way it was marketed. In the grand tradition of NES box art like Mega Man, River City Ransom, and Kid Cool, the box art here is terrible. It looks like a direct-to-video VHS box, but boring? It looks like these old direct-to-video ninja movie covers, just without ninjas, which kind of defeats the point. It's almost as weird as the box art for Ghost Lion. The thing is, American Sammy went all in on this box art for some reason. The comic book / magazine ad highlights it over the gameplay screens and barely even explains what sort of gameplay to expect. Just why? This problem extends beyond the official marketing too. Considering that the game was featured on the main 1991 cover of Nintendo Power, you'd figure it'd be better known, but even this cover makes the game look boring. This is particularly mind-boggling considering the covers for the previous 2 issues. I mean, they made a full model of the mech for the Metal Storm cover, and the Power Blade cover has Nova, in full armor, throwing his blade directly at the reader. The Vice Project Doom cover, on the other hand, has the reader watching a guy climbing a ladder through binoculars? Nope, sorry, that's not quite fair. The cover has the reader watching a guy with binoculars watching a guy climbing a ladder. It was clearly a slow month for Nintendo Power. The big games for this issue, aside from Vice Project Doom, were the NES version of The Rocketeer, The Lone Ranger, which will definitely be getting a Weekend Rental episode at some point, and Adventures of Lolo 3. I have to assume Vice Project Doom got the cover by default because it wasn't licensed or, well, Lolo. Sorry Lolo, but you know it's true. But considering the game they were working with, they could have made the cover a little more exciting. Or a lot more. I don't get why the Western marketing for this game was so bland either. It's not like they didn't have decent material to work with. Gundeck, the Japanese version of Vice Project Doom, got this box art, which is much more interesting. Sure, like Metal Gear's box art is a blatant copy of Kyle Reese from The Terminator, Gundeck's is John McClane from Die Hard 2, but still, it's better than this. Either way, the cover art, Japanese or American, was a decision made by the game's publisher, Sammy Corporation, known in North America at the time as American Sammy. American Sammy was what you might call a B-tier publisher for the NES, releasing such games as Amagon, Thundercade, Ultimate Basketball, and Ninja Crusaders. Ah, there's the bad direct-to-video ninja artwork. In fact, looking at these covers from the NES era, the Vice Project Doom box art kinda starts to make sense. I say from the NES era because, believe it or not, Sammy Corporation is still around, just not as a game publisher. Well, sort of. See, Sammy, much like modern Konami, found massive success producing pachinko machines and decided, rather than focus on video game publishing themselves, to invest heavily in, Sega. In other words, anytime you see the Sega logo in the modern era, there's a silent Sammy at the end. Sammy was just the game's publisher, however. They did not make Vice Project Doom. That honor falls to ICOM. Much like Sammy could be called a B-tier NES publisher, ICOM could be called a B-tier NES developer. This makes sense because Sammy actually bought them as a subsidiary in 1992. ICOM developed NES games like the aforementioned Amagon and Ultimate Basketball for Sammy, the Golgo 13 follow-up The Moffat Conspiracy for Vic Tokai, and Astyanax and Totally Rad for Jalico, although they had no hand in the amazing English language manual for Totally Rad. Their output would diminish considerably post-NES, and they would wind up breaking away from Sammy in 1996 to join up with SNK under the name Yume Kobo, making games for the Neo Geo until folding in 2001. This game, though. Vice Project Doom clearly wants to be the action game for the NES. And it kinda sorta succeeds, except no one knew about it. What it does really well. It's just that what it does has very much been done before. The majority of the game plays as a cross between Ninja Gaiden and Castlevania. In other words, it's a fast-paced, side-scrolling action platformer of a very specific type. Vice Officer Quinn Hart, the player character, is agile and climbs ladders like Ryu Hayabusa, but his main weapon is a laser whip, which actually has more in common with the Belmont clan's vampire killer, most notably the ability to attack from behind when Hart draws back to strike. Hart and the player also have access to ranged attacks in the form of his 9mm, which fires straight ahead like Ryu's shuriken or Simon's daggers, and grenades, which he lobs like a cross between the axes and holy water in Castlevania. The interesting thing about these secondary weapons is that while yeah, they're both finite, requiring ammunition, you are never in danger of losing them as a resource. You don't need to worry about accidentally swapping them out for a weapon you didn't want, or losing them when you die, an issue in both Castlevania and Ninja Gaiden, and you always have access to them as long as you have ammo for them. I'll be honest, the play control for the side-scrolling sections really feels better than either of the game's inspirations, at least to me. Hart is able to move left and right while climbing, allowing him to better avoid or take aim at enemies, has pinpoint movement, which is key for the platforming, and doesn't have the very slightly jerky feeling of Ryu Hayabusa's running and jumping. Yeah, I said it. Plus, he's able to run while crouching, something neither Ryu nor Simon Belmont can do. Oh, and while Hart's whip attack does echo Simon's, Hart's is much faster, and he doesn't have to stop to swing his laser whip. Part of the reason Hart can handle so well is because the graphics and animation in the game are fantastic. Hart's movement is fluid, whether running while crouching, climbing, jumping, or attacking. All of this makes controlling him feel so much better than it would otherwise. Also, while we're on the subject, can we just talk about the environments for a moment? I mean, look at this waterfront cityscape in the first side-scrolling level. Then there's the fact that in the Chinatown stage, the light from the various fires casts flickering shadows on the statuary in the level. The whole cloud cover and background on the train are just jaw-dropping. There are even little touches like the exhaust fans spinning in this area, or the fact that when the lights flicker in this area, they actually cast shadows, not just go on and off. This is an amazingly good-looking game for the time, and doesn't get the credit it deserves for its pixel art. Coming back to the gameplay, Vice Project Doom does not lack for diversity either. This side-scrolling action platforming is not the only gameplay style in the game, nor is it the only style that has been borrowed from other games. There are also first-person shooting segments which play a lot like a combination of the bonus stages in Shinobi, and, as Joe from Same Name Different Game pointed out in in Roger the Retro Gaming Puppet's Obscure Old Games video on Vice Project Doom, Operation Wolf. While these stages seem like they break from the side-scrolling stages, there is a mechanic linking them together. While in first person, Hart cannot use his laser whip, which I get, because trying to animate that on the NES in a way that would be properly functional would be a nightmare. Because of that, the player only has access to Hart's gun and grenades, which use the same ammo collected during the side-scrolling levels. This is a nice touch because the shift in gameplay doesn't just eschew all of the mechanics from one style to the other. The problem, though, is that I did find myself hoarding bullets and grenades throughout the game in preparation for these stages. The other gameplay style lifted from another source is when Hart gets into a car chase. These driving segments shift the game to a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up where the player has to pay attention not just to the enemies assaulting them, but obstacles on the road and the edges of the road itself. I'd say that this borrows whole cloth from Spy Hunter, but let's be real, Spy Hunter never played this well. Super Spy Hunter, on the other hand, The only issue with that claim is that I'm not sure which would be copying from which. According to Wikipedia, Gundek came out in Japan on April 26, 1991, but I couldn't find a concrete release date or even year for Battle Formula, the game that would be reworked into Super Spy Hunter in North America. Hardcore Gaming 101 places the game in 1991, but isn't any more specific than that. Moby Games says it was released in 1992, but also says that Nintendo Power reviewed it in June of 1991? Famicom World gives a release date of September 27, 1991, but that conflicts with the Nintendo Power review. Needless to say, the similarity between the driving segments and Super Spy Hunter is notable. The driving segments are also notable for another reason. Well, the first driving segment at any rate. See, when the player first starts up the game, after the opening cutscene, another aspect lifted from Ninja Gaiden, all they get is a black screen telling them to press start, not a proper title screen. The reason for this is because the game throws the player into the first driving stage as a stinger sequence to the game proper. After taking down the boss vehicle and getting a cutscene setting up the initial mystery of the game, something we will come back to in a moment, then the title screen comes up. It's a really cool way of structuring the opening of the game, which gives it a cinematic feel that even Ninja Gaiden didn't offer. Which is great because the story structure quickly goes out the window. Quick spoiler alert here, because while the story is incomprehensible at times, there are twists in the second half of the game. Admittedly, they don't have the impact they should, plus the Nintendo Power article just did not give a toss, straight up printing the twists, including the ending of the game, but we're going to at least give the courtesy of a warning. Okay, so here's the thing with the story. It's also clearly borrowing elements from Ninja Gaiden, but this time, it's not doing it well. The story involves aliens, clones, and a multinational pharmaceutical/chemical corporation all wrapped in a global conspiracy. While that all sounds cool, there are two issues. One, the narrative jumps around. A lot. You start out investigating a sci-fi mystery, then quickly shift to fighting a Tong magician in Chinatown for some reason. Then, jurisdiction be damned, you go to South America after being told that dirt on the initial suspect came from a town called Ricardo. Why South America? Because Ryu did it in Ninja Gaiden. Also, the war on drugs, but we'll get to that. After that, it's back to the US and... okay, there is a lot of location jumping and the thread kind of gets lost through it all. Suffice to say, there's an evil corporation run by aliens conducting experiments with clones. That's the issue with the characters in the game as well. There's a lot of jumping around and not a lot of explanation or, well, characterization. Ninja Gaiden did a good job of setting up who Ryu Hayabusa was, who his father was, and how the mystery of his father's death served as motivation for his actions throughout the game. Further, the additional characters were given proper introductions, whether it be archaeologist Walter Smith or CIA agent Irene Liu. Also, while the globetrotting nature of Ninja Gaiden did kind of strain credibility, it was still properly introduced and followed through via the cutscenes. Here though, while there is an initial mystery introduced, in the form of the driver of the vehicle Hart takes down at the beginning, the gun being used, and the green slime found in the vehicle, the characters just kinda show up? Christy just appears with no introduction or explanation for who she is or why she's there. Same with her friend Sophia, who doesn't even get a decent exit from the story. She just stops popping up in cutscenes. If the player reads the manual, they will learn that Christy is on the same Vice Squad as Hart and that they're dating, but none of that is actually conveyed in the game proper. Sophia doesn't even get that much, and her bio in the manual is literally 2 sentences long. Both Christy and Sophia just show up for a few cutscenes in the first half of the game as an exposition dump. Christy then gets kidnapped, and is revealed to have been grafted to the mutant exosuit that serves as the boss for Stage 9. That's it. There's no relationship or character building, just here's some exposition, hope you read the manual so you know who I am. Sure, Hart is broken up over learning that he killed Christy by defeating the Stage 9 boss, but there isn't any real relationship developed between the two to build to the sort of tragic reveal they were obviously going for. Christy and Sophia come across as fully realized characters by comparison though, because then there's Rhys. If you haven't read the manual beforehand, you discover after defeating it that Rhys is cybernetically linked to Stage 6's boss mech, which was apparently torture. The thing is, he isn't mentioned at all in the game, before this cutscene or since. There's clearly supposed to be some sort of emotional impact over this reveal and Rhys' subsequent death, but he wasn't established enough, or at all, for that to happen. I mean, okay, it could be argued that it's a nice bit of symmetry that two of the bosses turn out to be Hart's friends, entrapped in the web of the conspiracy, but it could also be argued that using the same twist multiple times is lazy storytelling. With Rhys, though, even the manual doesn't give him his own bio, only relegating his backstory to 3 sentences in the intro. Speaking of, we need to talk about that intro in the manual because it just straight up gives away most of the plot points of the game's main mystery. It outright states that the green gel is of extraterrestrial origin and that it is sustenance for aliens living among humanity. It also states that it has terrible effects on humans who consume it, explaining why the driver at the beginning of the game is so horribly mutated. Plus, it mentions that the aliens are using clones, which, combined with the head of the evil Beta Corporation being shown as looking exactly like Hart in the opening cutscene, just completely blows the reveal that Hart is a clone himself and is meant to ascend and take control of the Beta Corporation on behalf of the aliens. Here's the thing though, while the story jumps around and doesn't make a whole lot of sense, there is another level to what the game is doing, which, while again referencing other sources, adds a new dimension to the plot, the presentation, and the gameplay. The fun part is that, in that previously mentioned Obscure Old Games video, Roger, hints at what the game is doing without outright stating it. When talking about the cutscenes, he makes note of the following.
They talk a lot about the stuff in the early going. The Stuff? I love that movie! For my money, it's the best Larry Cohen-Michael Moriarty collaboration.
The thing with this clip is that, yeah, it's passed off as a joke, but I know Joe is enough of a horror movie person to recognize that he does hit the nail on the head, because the game is actually riffing on the stuff with its green gel. Sure, the gel itself is not alive like the stuff, but the fact that it's a food source that causes horrible mutations in regular humans who consume it is a clear reference to that movie. More than that though, what the game and the stuff have in common is a very specific form of body horror. When most people talk about body horror on the NES, it's usually in reference to Abadox or Life Force, which, fair enough, makes sense. Both games are steeped in pulsating organs and intestines and enemies with their insides on the outside. With those games though, the body horror on offer is more cosmic scale. The player is an invading body, a relatively tiny one at that, and the body horror comes in the form of giant monsters whose innards you need to blast through. Here though, a more, let's call it intimate body horror is being presented. This idea is part of what scholar Julia Kristeva in her book Powers of Horror talks about as abjection. Without getting too far into the weeds with this, her notion of abjection is a societal framework used to separate the human from the non-human and to violently expel or deal with anything that falls under the latter category. As she terms it, radically excluded. Examples of this would be unnatural body changes, think violent transformations or bodily mutilation, or bodies that are deemed abnormal, internal fluids and body functions made external, such as blood, vomit, body wastes, or, other body fluids, corpses and corpse mutilation, and bodies without souls, so to speak. So, again, Abadox and Life Force do fall under the umbrella of abjection, but on a cosmic level, a scale Kristeva did not seem to have in mind when discussing abjection and horror. Vice Project Doom, on the other hand, offers Kristeva-esque abjection in spades. Even in the first post-title screen level, you've got these guys stuck crawling on all fours because of the massive spikes growing out of their backs. Qianqi, interestingly enough, considering they are reanimated corpses from Chinese folklore, and which I recognize thanks to FCI's Phantom Fighter, and okay, the pumpkin heads are kind of ludicrous, but still qualify. In later levels, as the player dives deeper into the conspiracy and the, well, bowels of Project Doom, they encounter mutant rats, in a sewer level no less, while wading through clearly less than sanitary water, unnaturally electrified humanoids in a factory setting, and most overtly, half-slime humanoid creatures that spit goo out of their mouths in front of tanks full of half-formed biological experiments. This last one gives way to an undulating level where the same slime creatures are out in force, along with weird human-slug-scorpion hybrids, in front of rows of tanks of cloned humans. This doesn't even take into account the biomechanical bosses who hurl slime at you, or throw globs of sentient slime when they attack, or human-wolf hybrids, or you get the idea. The game covers essentially all of the aspects of abjection Kristeva talks about, which is honestly kind of a problem. Let's go back to her categories for a moment. The whole unnatural body changes, or bodies that are deemed abnormal thing, carries some uncomfortable connotations, and the game demonstrates that. This category others people with disabilities, people with different bodies, and people who have undergone changes to their bodies. Those crawling spiked guys? They don't attack the player. They just crawl and honestly look like they are in significant pain. That doesn't matter though, because the player still destroys them as part of the game. This also applies to the initial suspect Hart takes down. His hands have been mutated into claws by the green slime, so he is treated as monstrous and something to be radically excluded. In other words, destroyed. This is actually part of a larger problem with discussing Kristeva's ideas. Sure, she talks about how disabled, or so-called deformed bodies being othered was a part of religious doctrine, but she also participates in othering herself. What I mean by this is, she's racist. She actually published a book called About Chinese Women, which was written strictly from a Eurocentric perspective and orientalizes Chinese women as a result. She has been called out for it and other instances of her racial bias by no less than Gayatri Spivak, so yeah. When talking about Kristeva's take on abjection, it's important to realize that, other ethnicities implicitly fall into that category as well. On that note, there's one more issue we need to discuss, one hinted at by the title of the game. There's a reason the title leads with Vice. Remember, Hart is a Vice Squad member. That initial suspect? Yeah, the implication is that he was supposed to be a drug dealer who had dipped into his own supply. Not only does this make the suspect abject via the transformation brought on by the green slime, but also stigmatizes drug users as literal monsters. That's the other reason Hart goes to South America. Sure, Ninja Gaiden did it first, but also Hollywood action movies treated South America as the source of all drugs, especially in the 80s. In that regard, choosing Die Hard 2 John McClane for the Japanese box art wasn't quite as random as it would seem. In that movie, he is fighting a South American drug lord military leader after all. Yup, that's right, this is another literal war on drugs video game. Like Narc, just with sci-fi trappings. The thing is, if we're comparing Vice Project Doom to Narc is somehow the more progressive game? Yeah, they're both full-on war on drugs games, but Narc at least lets the player arrest perps instead of just blowing them all away. There is no similar option in Vice Project Doom. All of the gameplay options are macho and lethal, just like those Hollywood action movies I just mentioned. There's a reason Hart winds up killing 2 of his own friends in the course of the game. Vice Project Doom is not the most original game on the NES, nor does it have the most well-told story. It's a game that combines elements from popular NES games that came before it, along with heavy pop culture influences from the era, just not always with complete success. Instead of just coming off as plagiarism though, it manages to mix these elements into an experience that does offer something unique for players, in spite of, or maybe even because of its flaws. The attempt to tell a compelling sci-fi story, its more personal approach to body horror, even with the issues tied to that, and the polish of its gameplay, all add up to make it a good weekend rental.
One more thing.